Yeah, thank you all for having me. I guess I probably should have just made my slides just pictures of my dogs, but I went a different direction here. So as Dr. King mentioned, I teach in the English department, but for the most part, I don't study the kinds of texts that you might typically think about when you think of English classes, novels, poems, things like that. Instead, as she mentioned, I focus on how digital technologies are changing the ways people write, and specifically the ways that students learn to write and practice writing. So that includes things like social media and podcasts, but today, of course, I want to focus specifically on video games. So there are a couple classes that I teach at MTSU focused on games. One on the left here is a general education course where we play and analyze games as a form of literary storytelling. And then this semester, I'm teaching that course on the right, which is an upper division course on narrative design. And that focuses on the kinds of writing that go into making games. And so I'm going to draw a little bit on the framework for both of these courses as I talk today, the sort of more analytical side and the more like how do you write for these things kind of side. Because I think this is a really useful genre to think about sort of like what play looks like and how writing plays a role in that kind of experience in the worlds that we inhabit today. And with that in mind, I wanted to ask a few quick questions here just to sort of gauge the room. So I'm curious, for you all, how many of you read literature on a regular basis? And I'm not just talking like Toni Morrison and Herman Melville here, like if you're reading fan fiction, if you're reading YA, whatever, like just like raise your hand if you're reading pretty regularly, okay? Raise your hand if you at least semi-regularly engage in creative writing. You do your own writing in some way, shape, or form, okay? Maybe like a third, sort of half, okay. Different set of questions. How many of you play video games on a regular basis? All right, that's not everybody, but that's a lot. How many of you regularly make games? Maybe one? Okay, good. You've answered in the way that I anticipated. And the thing that I think is important here is that even though our world is like, I mean, we're all playing games pretty frequently. Not everybody, but a lot of you know, are engaging in video games pretty regularly. But we don't make games in the same way that we might make writing in a way that runs parallel to the kind of reading practices that a lot of you all are doing. You know, if you're reading on a regular basis, you may be able to write as well. If you're playing games, there's a much less frequent jump into actually making games as like a flip side of that. And we may not sort of like think of reading or creative writing as like play, because those are activities that have developed a certain amount of like cultural cachet. We tend to think of those in some ways as like more serious pursuits than playing games. But they are ways of engaging our imagination, right? When you're reading, when you're writing, you might be amusing yourself, you might be putting yourself in the shoes of a different person, sort of playing around with different perspectives or worldviews different than your own. And at this point, you know, the technologies for writing are so common, whether it's pen and paper kind of stuff, whether it's a word processor, whether it's the Notes app on your phone, you know, you can write your own stuff pretty readily. And more than that, you know, writing is really baked into schooling in a lot of different ways. I would guess a lot of you did a ton of reading and a ton of writing in your K-12 education, but probably a lot less, maybe a little here and there, but a lot less playing of or making of games. But I think it's worth keeping in mind, like in the world that we live in, and that number on the right is so big that it actually ran out of the box that I tried to put it in. But you know, in our current kind of economic situation, a couple years ago, 2023, the publishing industry in the U.S., its revenue over the course of that year was $29.9 billion. That's a lot of money. But the U.S. video game industry was at almost twice that in 2023, with revenue in the arena of $57.2 billion. So economically, culturally, socially, video games have this huge footprint that exceeds even that of publishing in the more conventional sense, you know, books and things of that nature. But in terms of the kind of like work that we do or the ways that we engage with games, it's often much more focused on sort of consumption and playing those games than it does on making them and thinking about the logics that games depend on. You know, and I would guess a lot of you probably over the course of these last couple of years bought a game. Maybe you bought something inside a game, an outfit, an upgrade, some kind of in-game currency or something like that. But what's going on the opposite side of that process for a lot of folks is a little bit of a black box compared to how easily you might be able to imagine what it looks like to put a sentence or a poem or a short story together. Now, there are good reasons for that. Part of this is the complexity of the tools and the work involved. You know, developing a game typically involves the collaboration between a lot of different people with a lot of different skill sets, whether it's, you know, computer programming, visual and graphic design, you know, music composing, writing itself, all those different kinds of things. That's a lot more wide-ranging than the work that might go into writing a poem or a short story. And I also don't want to downplay the importance of just playing games here. I think that's a worthwhile pursuit in its own right. And you know, if you at the end of the day just want to hop into Marvel Rivals for an hour, play a couple days in Stardew Valley, pull up the Pokemon card game on your phone, you know, I'm not judging you for that. But I think it's really useful to think about the kinds of writing and the kinds of kind of narrative structures that go into these games. Because in a lot of ways they indicate the writing that surrounds us day to day. Choice and interaction in particular is what I'm thinking about here. You know, when you get into like a social media app like TikTok, and you're swiping in different directions to sort of like train your algorithm in terms of what it feeds you, what you want to see, what you don't want to see. You know, there is something there that runs a little bit akin to the logics of video games. Like the online environments that we live in and often write in have elements of interaction and choice to them that run in a lot of ways much more parallel to video games than they do into more conventional kinds of literature. And so games, I think, can give us a little bit of a glimpse and in the right context gives us a chance to reflect on the sorts of choices and the sorts of interactivity that are really central to the everyday writing practices and platforms that sort of drive our world day to day. And these are a key part of games. So Sid Meier is probably most famous for having a leading role in the Civilization series of games. He's often quoted for this famous line right here: games are a series of interesting decisions. Now, in Meier's case, he's somebody who makes a lot of kind of strategy games where those decisions have to do with like how do you allocate resources, how do you engage with the other nations in a game of civilization as you're playing it. But I think for the sake of today, this also really applies to story-driven games as well, where a lot of what often separates a story-driven game from like a novel or something like that is that we get to make interesting decisions along the way that have an effect on how the story plays out. Now, of course, and I think there's an important preface here I'm going to spend a little time on. We make decisions when we read too, right? What we read, when we put down a book because we're bored with it, what characters we relate to or don't relate to, whether we want to reread a passage because we found it especially moving or confusing. You know, conventional forms of literature can face us with questions. One example I wanted to look at here is from a sci-fi author, Ursula K. Guin, who, among many other things that she's written, has a famous short story called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And what this story does is present the reader with a sort of sci-fi utopia. You get a glimpse inside this city called Omelas, and you see people, you know, moving around this city, sort of interacting with each other on the day of the festival. There's a scene where you see a young child, you know, playing a flute. You know, in a lot of ways, kind of very conventional, sort of peaceful utopian setting. But partway through the story, and she does this a number of times, she addresses the reader directly. Do you believe? Do you accept the festival, the city, the joy? No? Then let me describe one more thing. And what she goes on to do is to describe the sort of like dark underside of this city, where there is, for unclear reasons, this young child who is kept in a cage in a basement, who is seen as being integral to the ongoing peacefulness and functionality of this city. And that there's a certain moment as people who live here get older that they find out about this child, and it ends with sort of talking about every once in a while a young person who has just found this out, or an old person after sort of years of reflection will leave the city, no longer being able to sort of countenance this dark underside that their life is predicated upon. And so Le Guin's not alone in this kind of writing. Like, there's a lot of works in sci-fi and literary fiction and things like that sort of address the reader directly, that ask you either explicitly or implicitly to ask, like, what is the morality or the ethical decision making that's underpinning this text? What are we pushing on here? Maybe by taking a part of the world that we experience and are sort of dimly aware of from day to day, like the fact that sort of many cultures premise themselves on their needing to be this group that is blamed for all the things that are going wrong and are punished for it, even if they are in no way responsible for the problems of that culture. But Le Guin's work really gets kind of directly at this question in pieces like this story. And that's something that she's really explicit about. Another piece, and I teach both of these in one of my games courses because I think it's a useful way of pushing back on some of the narrative conventions of games, is an essay called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. And what she kind of argues throughout this piece is that a lot of our stories tend to fall back on this sort of very stereotypical hero's journey. Right? Some of you may have heard that term before. It's kind of the story structure that was influential on media properties like Star Wars and things like that, where you have a hero who faces hardship and defeats the enemy and comes back home, saves the day, all that kind of stuff. And she ties this back to sort of like, both of her parents were anthropologists, so she's very dialed into questions of human culture and history. The notion of sort of like early mammoth hunts as these like stories that might have been shared around a fire, where groups of hunters share the tale of taking down a mammoth. But that really, for a lot of people in this environment, the story of the day was having a child, you put in a little bag, you carried around, and you picked oats, or you picked other vegetables or grains, and you put them in that little bag, and that was kind of the journey that you went on over the course of that day. And Le Guin, drawing on writers like Virginia Woolf, among others, kind of argues that there is a really important reason to try to share and emphasize those kinds of stories, sort of quiet, everyday stories, where fiction functions more like a little carrier bag than it does a way of conveying an epic journey. And in doing so, and I have that line highlighted all the way at the bottom over here, she tries to emphasize that the things she likes about these kinds of stories, novels in particular she's pointing to here, is that instead of heroes, they have people in them. And I mention this because, a lot of games, and again, I played some of these games, I'm sure some of you do too, like they position you as the hero, right? The game might be a power fantasy, where it's a chance for you to feel like you have total control over the world that you live in. Anything you do is justified because you're the chosen one, you're the special boy, you're the special girl, right? You can go out there and save the day and everything you do is going to be justified because you're the hero and your enemies are the evil destroyers of the world. But there's a level of complexity that Le Guin points at here, where she's thinking about the importance of telling person-driven rather than hero-driven stories. And I mean, you can even look around at the way this logic structures like certain corners of the world that we live in. If you exist on certain corners of the internet, there's been the popularization of like the NPC meme the last few years. It sort of asserts that certain people are really like the heroes who are making independent decisions in the world, and other people are just NPCs who are being sort of led by society and don't have their own agency, and thus anything negative that we throw at those people is deserved because they're just NPCs, right? Like this video game logic of like the hero in the world of people who don't really have control over their lives has like a tantalizing power to it if you can position yourself as that hero who is exercising free thought unlike everybody else, right? So with this, I want to start pivoting into games, and what ultimately I want to look at over the course of the rest of this, this talk is going to be more focused on games that try to, ultimately, we'll go through a few counterexamples, but try to tell stories about people. And how games try to go about, both on their front end and the back end, creating systems that can work through and deliver those stories in interesting ways that don't just make you feel that sense of power surging through you as you exercise control over the game's world, but that make you face down some different kinds of ethical and moral decisions along the ways. And that are playful still, in a certain sense. You still play these games in our sort of common parlance, but that ask you to sort of like play around with working through different worldviews, working through different perspectives, and not just blasting forward with a sword or a laser gun as fast as you can. Before I get into this stuff, I think there's one really important distinction to keep in mind as we move forward from here. So with games, there are sort of two arenas of writing work that are often done, sometimes by the same, but sometimes by different members of a game team. One is narrative design. So narrative design is essentially building systems for story delivery. So how do you build the structure that a game has that is going to deliver choices and then have consequences that pay off because of those choices in different ways for the player? Whereas the game writer is often the person or the people who are doing more of the writing of the actual content, right? They're doing the writing that you're actually seeing on the screen or hearing delivered by a voice actor when you're playing a game. Whereas the narrative designer's work is often more on the backside, but they are building the systems, which is part of what we're going to get into here, that drive how the game's story unfolds, not just what words make up that story. And both of these are going to play into the examples that I want to walk us through. I am going to zag a little bit to the side for just a second to start with this game here. Anybody by chance recognize what this game is? This is Space War. So this is a game that was developed in the early 1960s at MIT, at the University of Massachusetts, that was really meant to be a way for people in an era where computers were super specialized technology, in an era where you would not have had laptops in this room. At most, there may have been like one computer in one specialized lab on MTSU's campus that people could take time maybe using if they could get a half-hour slot somewhere. But one of the things about those early computers is because they were so specialized, people didn't necessarily know what to make of them, know what to do with them. Like, what is this weird box? And so a lot of early video games like Space War were meant to be a way that people who didn't have specialized training in computer science could interact with computers and understand what they were doing. Could play a game like Space War where there's two little ships and you control them and you shoot at each other and you try to blow the other one up, right? But it was a way for people to get a sense of what computers could do and how they work. So even in this moment, I think it's important to point back to these early days of games because yes, on one hand, they are a way for people to be entertained, but they also have this playful function of taking cutting-edge digital technology and making it comprehensible, making it understandable to sort of an everyday person. And even though at this point, computers, video game consoles, they're just common consumer electronics at this point, they are not the specialized things they were when Space War came out, there are still ways where I think, looking closely and thinking carefully about how games work can help us think more carefully about the technological context that we're sort of living in. One other early game I want to look at here, and here we're getting a little bit more directly into the history of storytelling in games. I'll ask again, anybody recognize this one?
Okay. Something similar.
Colossal Cave Adventure. So this is an early storytelling game. Again, still kind of at a moment, just by virtue of what this computer looks like, you might be able to guess that this is still computers as specialized technologies. This is a game that used what was called a parser to interpret verb and noun inputs from users who are navigating a fantasy world that is based actually on the real geography of Mammoth Cave. So if you ever drive a couple hours north up 65 to Mammoth Cave and you get down in there and do a little tour, you are experiencing the geography that is in text form represented in this game. But if you can't kind of read what's at the top there, it says, you are standing at the end of a road before a small brick building. Around you is a forest. A small stream flows out of the building and down a gully. And then you see a little caret there, and the player is saying, enter building. So the game then has you enter the building. You are inside a building, and it gives you a textual description of what's in the room. Get lamp, there's a lamp in the room, check your inventory, very basic stuff. But this was one of the early important games in crafting kind of a storytelling engine that people could engage with. And the guy who made this, William Crowther, was very influenced by his own Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, which, yes, Dungeons and Dragons was already around when this computer game came out, and also by the fact that his ex-wife Patricia Crowther was also a computer programmer who discovered the connection between the Mammoth Cave and the Flint Ridge Cave system up in central Kentucky. So there's influence from tabletop games here, but sort of mashed up with the storytelling capabilities of early computing technologies, where you could use that parser to make choices in the game, at least in terms of what items you pick up, whether you go north or south or east or west, to navigate the world of this game. So you're starting to see some real choice come into how people are interacting with the story here, and not just the sort of blowing up each other's ships kind of stuff of Space War. Now, if we were going to be here for 3 hours, I would talk about a lot more stuff, but I'm going to jump ahead pretty quickly, which for some of you like, okay, finally, let's see some colors besides black and teal on the screen here. In the intervening years between the mid-70s when this game comes out to the present day, there's the continuing rise of point-and-click adventures, which take kind of this sort of logic and layer a graphical interface over it. If you remember at all, the King's Quest series of games, Secret of Monkey Island, there's a whole series of games kind of in that arena. Role-playing games kind of come into their own, and especially in Japan, you have the visual novel become a really popular genre of game. So there's a lot of developments in terms of interactive storytelling systems in games. But to get us a little more to the present day, the place I want to jump next is all the way to 2012. And once again, anybody recognize this one? I think it might be more likely this time.
It's The Walking Dead?
Walking Dead, yes. So this is the Telltale Walking Dead game. This is a series of episodic games that were linked to the very popular Walking Dead graphic novel and TV show made by a developer called Telltale. And what Telltale was really well known for was creating games that were by and large kind of choose your own adventure novels in digital form. And if you've ever seen memes of blank will remember that online, right? This is where that kind of meme comes from. Where you might do certain things to characters, you would respond to them in certain ways, take certain kinds of actions, and then you have a little message popped up, Clementine, will remember that, with an indication that that is going to have an effect on how this story plays out. And the Walking Dead games were very, very story-centered. There's not a lot of mechanics in here. There's not a lot of sort of combat or things like that. But it was an important step in sort of popularizing games where really the main outcome was you having to navigate the consequences, the moral and ethical and human consequences of the choices that you made and the actions that you took over the course of these games. You had other games, this is from, anybody? Mass Effect, yes. So Mass Effect, very popular series of sci-fi games by a developer called BioWare. And one of the things that Mass Effect added into the mix, it's not the first game to do this, but it's a pretty popular one, was to add a morality system that was sort of layered over the decisions that you made. So it wasn't just where do your decisions lead you, but are you making what the game calls kind of paragon or renegade, but sort of loosely maps onto sort of good or evil decisions along the way that had payoffs in how the story would unfold. And that's all tracked in a way that is hard for the player to see. They wouldn't put renegade in parentheses next to a choice. You had to reflect and do a little bit of thinking, although sometimes it's pretty obvious, of which decisions you want to make if you want to go down those different paths. And it gets a little bit more complicated than some old Star Wars games where you would have these choices about do you go to the light side or the dark side. And it was essentially do you chop this guy in half? Or do you say sorry and walk away, right? The decisions are often at least a little bit more complex where you have to do some thinking. You have to do some reflection on how do I want to engage with people? When there's not a clearly right and wrong person in front of me, or where my actions might not be justified, what's the call that I should make here? And so that's another place where you see storytelling and the way that game stories are structured start to take on some different kind of moral and ethical implications, is with the building of morality systems into games like this and things like Red Dead Redemption games, if you're familiar with those, where you're making choices, story-driven choices that play out in particular kind of defined ways on the backside of the game, but that aren't always clear to you as the player in terms of the sort of valence of the choice that you're making on the front end. A couple other games that start taking this forward, especially in the context of the rise of independent games that I want to point to. First, is a game called Disco Elysium. So one of the big shifts that's happened over the course of kind of the last 15 years or so, it stretches a little bit farther back than that in game development, is the rise of independent games. Games that, because of the relative availability of game-making tools to a broader set of the population, people were able to start making games that didn't have to depend on selling millions and millions and millions of copies, making a ton of money, and often, in order to attempt to do that, leaning into really popular genres or really kind of pleasurable, exciting kind of storytelling conventions. It's allowed some room for independent game developers to do some more sort of grounded, complicated, morally complex storytelling that doesn't have to rely on appealing to a huge, wide audience at sometimes a slightly more sort of superficial, the equivalent of a movie blockbuster kind of level. So Disco Elysium, for example, is a game where you are playing a lousy cop in sort of a fictionalized version with sci-fi elements of sort of a former Soviet bloc state. And over the course of the game, you are making different choices that have sort of different sort of moral and political connotations to them. So there's some resonances of things like Mass Effect here. But the game depends on skill checks. So if you are somebody who's ever played a Dungeons and Dragons or a tabletop game and you've rolled a die to see whether or not you succeed at doing something, the game does something similar. And it adds a degree of chance into the mix. So even though you can say, I'm going to allocate a lot of my energies in this particular direction, like in this game, you can say, I'm going to lean into being an authoritarian police officer who abuses my power at every opportunity. And you can get better at doing that. Or you can lean into really trying to listen to and argue with the people around you. So, I'm a rhetoric professor, so I was very excited to see that rhetoric is a skill in this game, right? You can lean into argumentation, you can lean into persuasion. And that causes the game to play out in very different ways, where there are ways where at a certain point in this game, if you decide I'm not going to put any of my skills into my physical constitution, you can sit in a chair and die, because the chair is so uncomfortable that your life is over. And the game is intentionally sort of humorous about that kind of thing. But it also digs into some really serious stuff. This scene right here is where you're having a confrontation with a character named Measurehead, whose name is a riff on late 19th and early 20th century eugenics movements in the US and elsewhere that believed that there were essential differences between people of different racial backgrounds, and you could tell those by measuring people's skulls, if you are familiar with the completely false and ungrounded pseudoscience of phrenology, right? That's what Measureheads kind of plan on here, and you make decisions about, do you internalize that belief system? Do you argue with him? Do you try to knock him out? And the game will go in different directions based on how you pursue that decision. And gets into a lot of complex sort of political ideologies along the ways in terms of what your character does and how they kind of fall. So this is a game that does, even though, again, it's set in a fictionalized country, it's got some sort of cyberpunky sci-fi elements to it, gets into some really complex questions around moral and political decision-making, and particularly the way that, state power, like police officers, are tangled up in those kinds of systems. You can compare that to a very different game, Oxenfree. So this is a game where essentially you are a young woman named Alex. You go with a small group of your friends to an island off the coast of Washington State for one last party before you all graduate from high school, and stuff starts to get weird, and you start to hear strange things over your radio. One of the really interesting things about this game is that the decision-making is timed. So you might look at this choice right here, where you're responding to someone with nada, no, and nope, as what on earth kind of decision is that? That is such a simple, this is not do you attack the person in front of you or do you make friends with them? It's not that kind of dramatic decision. It's how do you say no? But I would imagine if you take a moment and you think back maybe to when you were in high school, and you think of a time where somebody asked you a simple question, and you were like, oh God, how do I say this in a way that sounds cool, or reflects who I want this person to understand me to be? That like, even this kind of choice of like, how do I say no in this situation, and how is that gonna resonate in my social circle, and affect my reputation with the people around me, starts to become like a serious feeling choice. Do I go yes, or yeah, or uh-huh, when somebody asks me if I want to go out to lunch with them, right? Because the game times this, like this choice, if you don't make it fast, is just going to vanish, and your character is going to say nothing or default to an option that may not be the one that you want to take. The game, again, is going to play out in slightly different ways, and other characters are going to respond to you in different ways based on that. And so as much as this is, in some ways, a much more kind of like grounded, like high school kind of horror mystery game in some ways, where like the stakes are very different than Disco Elysium, the storytelling devices that time these decisions out and don't let you just sit there for 2 minutes going, what should I say? What do I know about this character? How might I respond to them? You got to make that decision on the fly in a way that can really resemble just like sort of high school social politics. One last example that I wanted to give, because I do want to drive home that this is not just, these kinds of decisions don't just happen through words. This is, last thing I'm going to show you, this is unpacking. So this is a game, basically the entire thing is you play as a young woman, who you don't really see much in the game, and you are simply unpacking as you move into a series of places that she has lived over the course of her life. So you unpack a dorm room, you unpack a first apartment, you unpack a house, and you're learning about who this person is and how she's growing and changing and staying the same, what her relationships look like, just by the objects that you unpack and what they look like as you go through these different time periods. So like you'll see that little like pig stuffy that's centered there, like it starts to look a little more ragged over time. And you can start to think about like what does that say about this person's attachment to this object. But this kind of storytelling can happen really productively, even just through visuals in a case like this. It doesn't have to be something that is conveyed solely through like words or sort of dialogue choices. It can come down to like, what am I doing when I decide where to position this one little object that this person possesses in their living space? Do I put that pig front and center, or do I try to put it in the back of a closet because I think like maybe I'm a little ashamed of it now because I'm getting a little too old to have pig stuffies. Now the thing I want to pivot to for the last few minutes here, and then I'll toss it for questions, is the way we start to dig into this stuff in one of those classes I teach, from the narrative design class. So far, like with all of these games we're looking at, I've been talking about the different storytelling systems that they employ, the kinds of decisions that they face you with, but often these things are hidden from view of the player in certain kinds of ways, like in the way that they play out. Again, whether it's like in Mass Effect, not knowing if something is a Paragon or Renegade choice. In Oxenfree, not knowing exactly what's going to be the dialogue option that makes the person you're talking to think you're cool or super lame. But it's hard often to get a sense of like, okay, but what does that look like? When you're like developing a game, what does that mean? And so I want to talk just for a few minutes here about Twine. Anybody heard of Twine here? Okay, good. A couple folks, but not too many. So if you go to twinery.org, you can check this out. This is an open source free tool that runs on Mac, PC, Linux. And it essentially is a way of building digital choose-your-own-adventure novels, choose-your-own-adventure stories. Interactive fiction is the term that is often used for what people create with Twine. But this is something I use in my classes because it's a nice way to start to think about how are game narratives put together. How do they make use of choices and decisions and leverage those to try to present players with interesting options along the way? So at a really basic level, like a Twine game might look like this. You have these little square passages that are linked together with arrows that sometimes circle back or jump back on themselves, where different story events or sort of location in the game's world are taking place at each one of those passages that are then linked together in different ways based on the choices that you make. And at the most basic level, and this is just from like a small, silly sample game that I've made for students in that class, you present choices by putting text in double brackets. and when a few words are in double brackets, they become a choice that in the playable version of the game, the player can click on. So in this case, you are faced with a legendary spoon, a weapon of great power in this fantastical world, and you can pick it up or leave it behind, right? And the player is able to choose between those options. But then the next level is, and the player doesn't see this in the same way, when you make that choice, it sets what's called a Boolean variable to a certain condition on the back end of the game. Now, if you're a computer science major or something like that, you may know what that means. In this case, it simply means if you get the spoon, it sets a variable to true, called spoon. And if you don't pick it up, it sets that same variable to false. And then later on in the game, we'll see this in a second, it will test whether or not that thing is true or not, essentially whether or not that light switch is on or off, to open up or close off certain ways of progressing or taking certain actions in the game. And that's one of the key elements of how these kinds of stories work, is just setting variables, whether true, false, or numerical. How many hit points do you have? Is it at or below 0? In which case your character dies and the game is over, or whatever, right? But setting those little variables is a key part of how game story logics operate. And one other big part of both Twine games and other kinds of both video games and computer programs writ large is if-else, or what's sometimes called if-then conditionals, where if a certain variable is true, it will display one series of text, which you see in that single bracket there. And if it's not, or else, basically, then it will display different text to you. And then you've got that paired with another kind of true or else variable tied to whether or not you picked up the spoon earlier down here at the bottom, right? But this is one of the big shifts with game storytelling from more conventional kind of literary storytelling, where things like variables that are getting set in or out of player view, if-else or if-then statements that are causing certain things to happen at different moments in the game, play up those consequences of like choices that you're making in different kinds of ways. And now, this little sample game I've been showing you, this is kind of a silly little game, again, that I just created for students that is meant to be sort of a riff on your conventional kind of fantasy journey. But in terms of the games that students make in the class, I ask them to push back on and try to challenge and think about what's going on with the storytelling conventions of games. And so for just a second, I want to highlight one last little game passage here. So this is from a game called Hero that a group of students in one of my classes made a few years ago. So this is what a Twine game kind of by default looks like from like the player's perspective. You see up at the top there, your character runs into your friend Braith in a small medieval fantasy village where you are both living. She has green eyes and long blonde hair. She's a little taller than average and in good shape from helping her parents in the fields. Braith's parents are farmers by trade. Here's the small spoiler that I will issue for this game. Braith is the hero who is going to go out and slay the Demon King and save the world. You, the player, have no special skills, and you basically spend the rest of the game getting your butt kicked anytime you try to engage in any sort of combat, and coming to terms with the fact that the rest of your life is going to be taking over your family business and running it. And what the students were going for here is pushing back on that like notion of like, what if you're not the bold, brave hero who is setting out to save the world, but the person who has to figure out how to live a sort of normal, average life while your friend goes off and becomes that person? Like, who's left on the sideline? And whose story is not told in the worlds of these kinds of grand kind of fantasy epics? And that's the game they tried to build. And it kind of leads me into the question I want to end with here, that I think is just worth keeping in mind with video game storytelling and sort of play in general. One of the big questions I would say, whether you're somebody who is just playing games and maybe wants to take some time to reflect on like, what are the assumptions? What are the presumptions under the surface of this game's logic and storytelling engine? What are the things I'm being faced with in terms of choices and decisions along the way? Or whether you want to dip into or already have dipped into like making your own games and thinking about how you structure those systems. I think considering games either from that more analytical or that creative end can help us think about how you design and write choices that allow people to play with new possibilities and to imagine the world and themselves differently, rather than just reinforcing that sense of I am the most powerful person who is always justified in my actions by virtue of being the hero, but by complicating that and challenging that a little bit by telling maybe more grounded stories in the vein of the sort of stuff Ursula Guin talks about, or by taking sort of video game stereotypes and intentionally kind of inverting and playing with them and imagining what might look differently there. And I'll leave it with that and toss it for any questions that you all have. Thank you for your time and attention.